So we're going to have a look at the impact of a maximum price on both the producer and consumer surplus. So first of all, we'll construct a maximum price diagram. Remember to label your axes, price and quantity. Insert your downward sloping demand curve. Remembering when obviously we're looking to compare the producer, look at the impact on producer and consumer surplus, remember to intersect the y-axis in order to make it really easy to demonstrate the impact on producer and consumer surplus. Let's put in our market equilibrium, label that price, label that quantity Q, and let's insert our maximum price. Remember to label the curve, maximum price, and label P max. Let's add in the quantity supplied first of all. That would be at Q1, and then the quantity demanded at Q2. So we've constructed our maximum price diagram. So as we're fully aware, the producer and consumer surplus would have been represented originally on the diagram prior to the maximum price being imposed, with obviously the consumer surplus being originally being the triangle that I've just traced there, or above the market equilibrium price, and then the producer surplus would have been the triangle below the market equilibrium price that I've just traced. So we've just run through where the original ones would have been. So let's have a look at now where they would lie. So the producer surplus would be this blue triangle that I have drawn in here and then just hatched off. So that would be the producer surplus, and we'll label that there as producer surplus. Producer surplus, because remember that is the producer surplus, because obviously the price has been lowered from P to P max, so now the producer surplus has become a lot smaller because fewer firms or fewer producers are willing and able to sell at that lower price, and obviously that's represented by only a quantity of Q1 being supplied. So obviously firms are only supplying a quantity Q1, so we see the producer surplus as this blue area. And the reason for that, just to reiterate, was that the price has fallen from P to P max, meaning less or fewer producers are willing and able to sell at that lower price of P max. Okay. Let's have a look now at the consumer surplus. So it may actually be easier just to draw a vertical line straight up from Q1 until it intersects the demand curve. The reason for doing that is this whole area now, I'm just currently shading in green, is representative of the consumer surplus. And the reason why that area is all representative of the consumer surplus is because that consumers are now more willing and able, they're more willing and able to buy at that lower price of P max. And the real benefit to the consumer, as mentioned just moments ago, is the price is lower. Of course, they'd like to purchase more, but the issue is that the producers are not willing to produce more due to a lack of profit motive, and as a result, it results in this triangle here representing a welfare loss. And we'll hatch that in black. Welfare loss. So just to reiterate, the producer surplus falls because the price has fallen from P to P max, so fewer producers are willing and able to sell at that lower price of P max at a particular point in time. Consumer surplus, well, that does increase because consumers are now able to obtain the product at a lower price, with the price falling from P to P max. However, there is a welfare loss, and that welfare loss occurs because although consumers can get a lower price for the product, the producers are not willing and able to sell a greater quantity of the product. They're only going to produce a quantity Q1, and as a result we have this welfare loss. It's just important to point out here that this green square that I'm highlighting, which is part of the consumer surplus, that green square is representative of a transfer from producer to consumer surplus. So obviously what's happened here is this green square that we've just highlighted was previously part of the producer surplus, but now that has transferred to the consumer surplus due to the lower price. The black triangle is representative where previous parts of both the consumer and producer surplus have been lost because producers aren't selling the product anymore, or selling enough quantity of the product, and consumers therefore can't purchase the product, so therefore no gains can be made by either party. So just to reiterate, the key points that we must know when we're talking about a maximum price is that consumer surplus increases, producer surplus decreases, but unfortunately the key issue that we've got here is there is a welfare loss to society, and that's the key issue that we come across. So that's a maximum price and how it impacts upon both producer and consumer surplus. Now what we're going to consider is the extent to which those impacts are seen. So we're going to do some evaluation. So first of all, we must consider, where is the maximum price set? Okay, so let's first of all consider if the maximum price is set very, very low. So i.e. furthest away from the original market equilibrium. So where is the market maximum price set, or the max price set? Very low. So let's draw a diagram to demonstrate a very low maximum price. We'll label that P, we'll label that Q. We'll add in our demand and supply curves. Supply, demand. We'll put in our market equilibrium originally. And now we'll add in a really, really low maximum price. So there we go. Maximum price. And we'll add in our quantities there. P max Q1 is the quantity supplied, and Q2 would be the quantity demanded at that max price. So as we can see here, we've got a very, very small producer surplus, which I'm just going to colour in. So the producer surplus would be very, very, very small with regards to a very low max price. As I said, to draw the consumer surplus, we should draw a line vertically from Q1, and we can shade in that area there. What that represents is the consumer surplus, and then we can see the area, the triangle to the right, is representative of the welfare loss. So what we can see here, with regards to a very low maximum price, we have a large welfare loss. We have a very small producer surplus, and we have a considerably smaller consumer surplus. Because obviously the large welfare loss has meant the consumer surplus has become smaller. And now let's compare this to a quite a high maximum price. And what we mean by a high maximum price is that the maximum price isn't very far away from the original market equilibrium. So if we just draw our diagram to elaborate and explain our point, what we have here is we'll just draw a demand curve, we'll add in our supply curve. There we go. Supply, demand, price, quantity, and then what we will do is we'll make sure this maximum price is close as we can to the original market equilibrium. Maximum price, P max, and let's add in our quantities now. So quantity supplied, Q1, quantity demanded, Q2. So if we have a look visually, we can see straight away that the producer surplus in this scenario is much larger than when we have a very low maximum price. So we'll make a comment on that in a moment. We can said to draw the consumer surplus. We go vertically up from Q1, the quantity supplied, and we can highlight that area there. And we can highlight the welfare loss with that triangle. We'll actually colour that in because we can see quite clearly where that is, and it's not particularly big. So we can quite clearly see when the maximum price is set quite close to the original market equilibrium, there's only a small welfare loss. What we see with regards to the producer surplus is we see that there is only a small decrease in the producer surplus. Only in comparison, that would have been to obviously a previous one. So actually we have a larger producer surplus. So there's a larger producer surplus. And what we also see is we see that there's a larger consumer surplus as well. And obviously, when we're saying a larger producer surplus and a larger consumer surplus, this is relative to the very low maximum price. So just to reiterate why we went through where the maximum price is set. If the maximum price is set particularly low, we will see a large welfare loss, whereas in comparison, if the max price is set a little bit higher, closer to the market equilibrium, we will only see a small welfare loss. When we look at the producer surplus, we can see if the maximum price is particularly low, we'll only have a very small producer surplus, whereas the producer surplus would be a lot larger in comparison if it was high. Obviously, it's really important to remember here that the producer surplus has decreased, but to what extent it decreases depends clearly on where the maximum price is. So obviously there's a large decrease, so we may just add that in. Small producer surplus, there's a large decrease. Obviously, if it's a larger producer surplus, only been a small decrease. Add those little bit of extra information in there. And then obviously a smaller consumer surplus when the maximum price is set particularly low. Again, obviously the consumer surplus here has become smaller, whereas it's a larger consumer surplus. The reason why it's become smaller over time is obviously the consumer surplus is obviously evidently being taken up by the large welfare loss. So that's that point come there. And obviously here we see a relatively larger consumer surplus. Obviously consumer surplus has increased. The reason it is larger is because obviously the welfare loss is particularly smaller. Okay, so key things to remember are we're comparing to the extent of the changes that we noted at the very beginning of the video. These changes, and we're going to have, and what we were doing there is we were seeing what extent those changes, what changes have occurred. And then the final evaluation point that we want to be considering when looking at the how maximum price impacts upon producer and consumer surplus is we want to be considering the price elasticity of supply. So first of all, we're going to consider if the price elasticity of supply is inelastic first of all, and we're going to draw a diagram for that. P, Q. And now we're going to make sure our supply curve is nice and steep to really emphasize the point that we're trying to make. And then we'll just draw a normal downward sloping demand curve. Like so. We'll add in our equilibrium of P and Q. And then we will add in our maximum price. And we'll label that obviously maximum price. So I do apologise. It's a little bit bent. Maximum price, and we'll label that P max. We'll obviously add in our quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Q. Q1 and Q2 there. Okay, so we can highlight in the key elements here. So we've got our producer surplus here. We've got that there covered up. We'll draw directly up from our quantity Q1, the quantity supplied, and we can see we have a very tiny welfare loss that I've highlighted in black. And then I will highlight in green the area of consumer surplus. And then we'll compare that with a price elasticity of supply, which is elastic. And then we can write some comments about the two. So draw a diagram for a price elasticity of supply, which is elastic. So we've got price, we've got quantity. We've gonna put our downward sloping demand curve in. And this time we're looking to make our supply curve nice and elastic. Like so. So supply like that. And then we're going to add in our equilibrium. So we've got price, we have quantity, and then what we're going to do is we're going to introduce our maximum price. And we'll label that maximum price. We'll label that P max. And what we'll do then is we'll add in our quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So we've got Q1 and then we have Q2. So that is that. And then what we will now do is we'll now highlight the key areas that we wish to discuss. So we've got producer surplus there in blue. We're going to draw directly up from our quantity Q1. Area to the right of that is our welfare loss, or a deadweight loss, whichever term you prefer. I'm just going to colour that in to make it nice and clear. It's that triangle there. And then we've got our consumer surplus. I'm not going to bother colouring this one in, and just to hatch the area to demonstrate. There we go. So the key points that we want to be considering when talking about whether the impact of price elasticity of supply on producer and consumer surplus, we want to be considering how that impacts upon both producer and consumer surplus. So what we see quite clearly, if the price elasticity of supply is inelastic, what we do see is we see a smaller welfare loss. So obviously when price elasticity of supply is elastic, we're going to see a larger welfare loss, and that is evident from our two diagrams. We can quite clearly see that that black triangle is far smaller than our black triangle here. And then we want to be considering the impact upon producer and consumer surplus. So what we see here with regards to the price elasticity of supply, with regards to it being inelastic, we see a smaller decrease in producer surplus, whereas here we see a larger decrease in producer surplus. And then what we see here is we see that there is a larger increase in consumer surplus, and here we see a smaller increase in consumer surplus. And the increases and decreases are all relative to the producer and consumer surplus prior to the maximum price. So we'll just make a note of that. Increases / decreases are relevant to the producer / consumer surplus prior to the maximum price. So just to recap the point on price elasticity of supply, the price elasticity of supply is inelastic. We have this very steep supply curve. We see a very small welfare loss. We see a larger increase in consumer surplus, because if we have a look, this very tiny top triangle would have been our original consumer surplus, but we see that far greater drop in price from P to P max, and that leads to a much greater increase in consumer surplus than in comparison to the price elasticity of supply, which when it's elastic we see this very large triangle would have been the original consumer surplus, but it only increases by this small rectangular area there, which is obviously not as great when compared to the original, not a greater increase as the increase here, which is when compared to the original consumer surplus. And then finally we look at the when we look at the producer surplus. Obviously we see with the producer surplus we see a smaller decrease in the producer surplus here, whereas here we see a larger decrease in producer surplus, and that's relative to the original here. So obviously the original producer surplus would have been this triangle here, and the majority of that has been reduced to this small producer surplus here, whereas in this scenario there's only been a smaller decrease in the producer surplus, because actually we maintain the majority of the producer surplus despite having a maximum price imposed. So just to recap, the key points to talk about when talking about a maximum price and the impacts upon producer and consumer surplus: consumer surplus rises, producer surplus falls, and there is unfortunately a welfare loss. The extent to which these increases and decreases occur, we must be considered in context with regards to where it is set and the price elasticity of supply. If the maximum price is set very low, we're going to see a far bigger decrease in the producer surplus, and therefore end up with a very small producer surplus. Whereas if the maximum price is set particularly high, what we're going to see is we're only going to see a small decrease in the producer surplus, and we see that here with quite a large producer surplus still being maintained. And then final point to consider is the price elasticity of supply. If the price elasticity of supply is inelastic, what we'd expect to see is we'd only expect to see a small welfare loss and a small reduction in the producer surplus relative to the original producer surplus, but we'd actually expect to see a large increase in consumer surplus. Whereas if the product was price elasticity of supply was elastic, what we'd expect to see is a large welfare loss. We'd expect a large decrease in the producer surplus. See, we only end up with this very relatively small area of producer surplus after the imposition of the maximum price, and we see only a small increase in the consumer surplus. And obviously we can compare the inelastic and elastic diagrams against each other. Thank you very much.